Good morning, everyone, on this warm Sunday morning. Welcome to service. Pastor Rick is still on vacation. He'll actually be back in the office. I think it's Tuesday, August 3rd or 4th, one of those days. Today we're lucky to have with us Deaconess Melissa James. She's been with us before. Always enjoy your message.
Good morning. It's always a blessing to be back with you all. Today, I want to start by having you think of a time when you were having a conversation and it seemed like you were answering two different questions. Can you think of a conversation like that where you're talking to someone and you're giving one answer and they're giving a completely different answer and you're like, but I thought we were having the same conversation here? Some giggles of recognition here. I want to start with a story because today I want to talk about finding the right questions and finding the wisdom. So I had spent some time in Tanzania with a friend of mine. A last-minute trip when our trip to Israel had gotten canceled. We were going to study abroad there. And so he turned to me and said, "Do you want to go to Tanzania?" And I'm like, "Sure," because that's what you do when you're 20 and can do that, I guess. So we traveled all the way from Iowa, where we were going to school, to Tanzania, and we studied there. We learned Swahili. Well, he learned Swahili. I did my best to not sound like a fool. We traveled around the villages. We had lots of conversations. We learned just a lot, including how different the two of us were, yet how much we had in common. Several years later, we ran into each other again, and we were having a conversation. And as he was one to do, he turned to me and said, "What have you learned? What have you learned?" And I thought for a moment. I thought of all the ins and the outs of being in seminary, which I was at the time learning about theology and the advocacy and the struggles of the most vulnerable and analyzing the systems of power and how to make change and what theology even had to say about all of that and where was God in all of this and what did it mean to be coming out in a church that was still debating the humanity of LGBT folks. And so I turned to him and I finally settled on the answer. I've learned that life is complicated. And he looked at me for a moment and I returned the question, "What about you? What have you learned?" And in his way, 2 years into med school, he turned to me and he said, "Actually, I've learned that life is quite simple. Feed cells and they live, don't and they die." So oversimplification of the biological processes aside, over 20 years later, and this conversation still sticks with me. I come back to it often. See, we were both in the process of being trained up to ask particular questions about the world around us. While our lives were certainly different, we each had learned to see things differently. And so when asked what seemed like a simple question, "What have you learned?" our answers were quite different. And yet there is something really important in our answers. Because even in our answers being very different, at the core of them, we are both seeking wisdom for the well-being of all. One of the things I learned throughout my life, but certainly in conversations like this, is that the questions we ask determine the answers we get. And so those who have the power to determine the questions have a lot of power to determine what sort of answers we get. So asking and finding the right question and answering them takes wisdom, takes discernment. And throughout all of our readings today, we have this theme over and over again of discerning of what to ask God. Being told, "Ask and you shall receive." Solomon is told, ask me what you will. And in that, this theme of discerning. Now, today, we live in this world where information is abundant and fast. I can go on my phone and open an app and ask for just about anything, and it can be delivered to my door the next day or even the same day. If I can dream it and my bank account is big enough or my credit line is large enough, I can have anything I want. Want something that doesn't exist yet? No worries. Ask AI. Don't like the evidence? Create your own. Go ahead and ask anything you want. Those who determine the questions that we're asking shape the direction of our attention, of our hearts, and where our resources go, without us even noticing that eventually we stop being the ones asking the questions, and we're answering the questions others are asking of us. Feet are too long? Here's something to make them shorter. Hair is too white? Here's something to color it. It's too dark? Here's something to lighten it. Whatever it is that is trying to be sold, is trying to be fixed. Whoever gets to define the problem gets to define the answers. So with seemingly everything at our fingertips, what do we do with that? If I could grant you anything right now, what would it be? What we don't often realize is that we're not only being offered information, we're being driven to the questions. If you've ever been in the situation where all of a sudden it seems like your phone or your devices are listening to you, and all of a sudden it's like, wait, I just had that thought and now there's an ad for this, right? So many of us have had that experience. Why? Because what's driving our questions themselves goes beyond ourselves. And in sociology, we talk about the sociological imagination, that of our individual experience being linked to this bigger world of our history, right? And of our social world. But at what cost does this access, does this confusion, does this barrage of information come? What cost to our relationships? What cost to our environment? And how do we go about finding out what are the right, not even the right, that's not the word, what are the questions that will help us get closer to what these parables Jesus is talking about calls us to, the kingdom of God? One of the things that our readings today help us start to point to in thinking about finding the right questions and the wisdom to answer it is that it comes back to this theme of good and evil, right? And oftentimes these texts, these parables in particular, are used in a very individualistic way, and particularly used to say these people are in and these people are out. This is the wheat, this is the shaft, these go to heaven, these gnash their teeth. And we use it to separate people. At least that's how these parables have been weaponized. But really what we're seeing both in these parables and it connected to our other readings is this deeper theme of discernment, of figuring out what it is that is good, what it is that is evil, what it is that will lead to this growth of from a mustard seed to this bush that provides shade and food and homes. You see, living faithfully is much more complicated than simply saying this person is good and this person is evil. It's much more complicated than being able to have the check mark or the X. Our questions that we ask are rarely that simple. We ask questions not of who is good and evil, but oftentimes we have to look past that to questions of what, for whom, and what is it that is getting in the way of life at its fullest, flourishing, not just for me, but for all those who are around. And when we have responsibility for others, those questions become all that more difficult and all that more important. Wisdom, that ability to discern and make choices for the good of all, is pretty hard to come by sometimes. And we don't often see it in our leaders. Which is why our reading from Kings, I think, is a very timely reading. Here we have the story of Solomon. right? So in Solomon's case, David has died. Solomon is his son. He becomes the king of the 12 tribes of Israel. He says, I am only a child, though what that actually means goes anywhere from 12 to 70. I mean, but the idea is that he's young in this role, and yet he becomes known as one of the wisest leaders. When he's given an opportunity in the presence of God to ask for anything, he takes that chance. But can you imagine what that must be like? How big of shoes you had to fill following David as a leader? Being with this God who can smite and burn bushes and do anything, and you can ask for anything. And what did he ask for? Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this great people of yours? And God saw that. God noticed, you didn't ask me to smite your enemies. You didn't ask me to get rich. That is not what leaders do. You asked me for wisdom. You asked me to help you understand what it means to rule wisely, to make decisions in ways that all might flourish. In order to lead a people, it meant not to do so to Solomon's benefit or to gather his own riches, but to do so in that way that all 12 tribes might flourish. Now, I don't know about you, but fortunately, I am not responsible for 12 tribes of Israel. That is not the level of decision-making that I do on a daily basis. Though, like all of us, there are decisions that we make regularly. There are choices we make in our everyday life that are unclear, where it seems like there's no good or right decision, where each decision seems like a bad decision and you're choosing from the least of the worst. And there are times when I look at those who are my leaders and look and say, what power do I have when they are not leading wisely, as Solomon might? What do we do? How do we discern in those moments what's right or wrong, what is good or evil, and what our responsibility for calling that out? So whether we're making decisions for us, for our loved ones, for a community or a world, discerning what is good or right or evil or wrong is rarely simple. In the book Emergent Strategies, Adrienne Marie Brown, one of my favorite authors, writes of a conversation she had with a collaborator, Gibran Rivera. And Brown says that Rivera articulated once, what is the next most elegant step when they faced a problem? What is an elegant step is one that acknowledges what is known and unknown, what the capacity of this group actually is. An elegant step, she went on to explain, allows humility, allows people to say, actually, we need to do some research, or actually, we need to talk to some folks, or actually, we need to take a pause. Oftentimes, when I would use this text in working with communities and churches, we would ask that question of what is the next most faithful step when things were unclear? Whether that was with a board or with a loved one trying to make decisions about care for someone that they loved, or in strategizing on how to hold governments accountable. What is the next most elegant step? What is the next most faithful step? Because we cannot always judge on face value when information is so abundant and so unclear what is always good and evil, and who are we to be the one to judge that? But we can take those bold, most elegant, most faithful steps. We can go into those times and those places where we know we do not need to be perfect in the choices that we make. Not one where we know all the answers, because we rarely know all the answers, but know that we can live in a complicated world where all the answers can be fraught. What is the move that we take that refocuses the question from I, or what will benefit me or bring me riches, to the we and the flourishing of all? And we know that we don't have to get everything right, and that we're not going to. That grace will hold us in those moments when there is no good answer, but we know that something needs to be done. And so we boldly take those next, most graceful, most elegant, most faithful steps. And so in these times that are uncertain, in these times when things are changing, in these times when life is lifing, may we have the humility to know what we don't know. May we have the commitment to the flourishing of all. May we have the courage to call out evil and hold our leaders to high standards and ourselves to love, and the wisdom of Solomon to seek guidance and support. Amen. May it be so.